And hello to everyone who's able to join us for today's panel discussion. Technologies we broadly call AI, or artificial intelligence, are vastly changing industries, from finance and advertising to medicine and logistics. But often the biggest hurdle to the adoption of AI lies in how well these so-called black box technology can be governed and controlled. But what role should the government play when it comes to AI, and should policymakers regulate this cutting-edge technology? Joining me to explore this topic in greater detail are three panelists at the top of their field. Daniel Gillblad, who is co-director of AI Innovation in Sweden, Francesca Rossi, IBM Research's Global AI Ethics Leader, and Elissa Strome, who is the Executive Director of the Pan-Canadian AI Strategy. Daniel, Francesca, and Elissa, very warm welcome to the panel. This is such an interesting field, and there has been a tremendous amount of debate when it comes to artificial intelligence and whether or not it should be regulated. So the first question I'd like to ask each one of you is quite simply, should governments control machine intelligence? Daniel, do you want to kick things off?
Sure, absolutely. And I guess, the immediate, very, very brief answer is no. Letting the government fully control machine intelligence is pretty risky, potentially stifles innovation, and in the end, possibly freedom of thinking and freedom of expression, basically. But of course, government must be involved and engaged. The government, and I'm speaking very much from a Swedish perspective, has a unique position to protect the individual rights. It has a unique position to level the playing field for everyone entering with AI services and so on, to create responsible innovation and responsible AI. And it also has a responsibility, definitely at least in Sweden, to ensure that we make use of AI to solve pressing issues in our society. And it really needs to step up here, basically.
Francesca, would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree, but I would add that, yes, so the regulation should not be given only to one stakeholder, even if it's the government. It should be a co-regulating environment, but also that it should not be, whatever regulation will be, it should not be the regulation of AI. It should be a regulation possibly of high-risk applications of AI, very contextual, very, at IBM we call it precision regulation, and not of a technology, but of the applications of a technology that may be high risk. And I see that both, in Europe and also in the US, there is this idea of a risk-based approach to possibly regulate, applications of AI. I also see, again, the co-regulation between governments, companies, but also with the help of standards organizations, because the ability to have shared, because the definition of a standard is a shared agreement about how to do certain things, whether it's to detect bias or to define it or whatever. It's important to really make sure that everybody follows the same best practices that are shared globally.
Thank you. And Elissa, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I tend to agree with my fellow panelists. In my mind, AI in itself is not a sector to be regulated. AI, in fact, is being applied to many already heavily regulated sectors, right? If you think of transportation, finance, health, those are already sectors that we have very strong histories of regulating and supporting innovation at the same time. And so I think what we need to do is really update our existing legislation, regulations, standards, as Francesca has pointed out, in order to be able to facilitate the adoption of responsible AI within those different sectors. I would just say the one place where regulation in respect to AI is key is in privacy, right? So we've seen already about 2 years now of GDPR and how that has been both supportive and also challenging in the adoption and implementation of AI. And other countries like Canada and others now have a lot to learn from how privacy regulation is evolving in response to AI. And in fact, we in Canada are in the process of looking at our own privacy regulations legislation in order to be able to understand how AI can be facilitated, but also privacy protected.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Turning back to you, Daniel, what is the government's role in accelerating the responsible use of AI for the good of society?
Well, first of all, if we go back to the regulatory aspect, I really want to emphasize what my fellow panelists have said here. And we can see that when we try to accelerate AI in Sweden, AI needs to be contextualized. And there are so many existing, let's say, foundations that we can build on, not only regulatory-wise, but also support-wise. I'm going to take an example, for example, from medicine in Sweden, where we already have an evaluation system of what you can do and cannot do, at least in research environments and so on. But it's possible to build on. That's developed over many, many years. It's contextualized, it means something within medicine and research. So let's build on those already existing support structures, because those things are needed. So we need to make sure that these kinds of regulatory aspects and so on are explained, that they're clear, that they're usable for businesses, for research and so on, so that we can really get this development going, basically. But in a very general sense, I mean, with the scale of AI as it is, as a broad general technology, it is very difficult for us to treat AI separate from other broader issues in society. If we want to regulate AI, we really need to look at what do we want our society to be. It doesn't necessarily matter if it's machines or algorithms deciding things, or if it's bureaucracy and other sort of machines that we've built over the years. Of course, now we can do it with more speed, we can do it with perhaps exaggerated biases and so on, but at least here in our country, we need a broader discussion on how to use these technologies, basically. These are very, very closely interconnected. And society also, at least here, needs to take responsibility for driving some critical systemic aspects. So a lot can come bottom up, and we can have a look at, for example, autonomous cars and so on. Great for personal mobility and possibly for the environment, but the top-down approach, how do we create a transportation system that is efficient, fair, doesn't actually kill people unnecessarily and is sustainable? That might not mean that we need to just develop autonomous cars. It's a completely different issue. And governments need to be involved here. And we also, and again, I can use a specific example, we need to push for AI, and only the government can do that in certain sectors. At least, again, in healthcare in Sweden, we're facing the fact that in 10 years, almost everyone graduating from high school will have to work within healthcare if we're going to support our current system. That is not sustainable, and the government needs to step in.
That's interesting. Thank you. So governments, companies, non-profits are all designing ethics charters and creating advisory bodies to lay out the definitions, the guidelines, and standards for the use of AI. Francesca, can you speak a little bit about the importance of said guidelines and standards that accompany AI regulation, so to speak?
Yes, so yes, in the past few years, there have been a huge amount of list of principles and guidelines around AI and AI ethical, considerations. I think that some projects put them all together, and they counted at least more than 80 principles. And what is good is, of course, they overlap a lot, these sets of principles. They have some main, issues that are being considered by all of them. And another thing that is good is that they are published, this list of principles, by not just a single stakeholder, not just by a single company or a single government, so on, but by multi-stakeholder activities and initiatives. And so that's very important, because you need to hear a lot of voices in order to understand what's the right principle, what's the right guideline, and so on. But having said that, I mean, now I think it's the time to move on from the principles to, actual, concrete operationalization of this principle, because these principles are very, very, compact and very high level, but they leave out a lot of details that are important when actually you are going to understand how to implement those principles within a company, for example, that uses AI or that produces AI. So that's what is important now. So the guidelines, the standards are important, but it's also important to understand how to operationalize them. And of course, these advisory boards are also important, but more than advisory boards are important, internal. At least that's what we did at IBM. We chose to have an internal AI ethics board that is not just advising; it has decision power in making deliberation and then making sure that the business units, the various divisions of the company follow those deliberations. Without that decision power, yeah, it's a nice, interesting discussion, but it doesn't have much impact. So that's very important. Having said that, of course, a company needs to talk with the rest of the world in both directions, to learn from the other stakeholders and the other initiatives, the non-profit organization, the government, and so on, but also to say what are the possible challenges that a company may have, or in general in a corporate environment producing AI, in operationalizing the principles. So multi-stakeholder is very important, governance is very important, with decision power and principles that now need to go to the next phase, which is to operationalize them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Agreed. Elissa, given the nature of technology and the way that information freely moves across borders, why is international cooperation on responsible AI so critical? And also, what are some of the practical things that the global community can co-develop towards that end?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Here we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and yet our worlds are still incredibly intertwined. We've got, 700 participants in this conference from all over the world, all different time zones coming together. So, our economies are heavily intertwined and our world is deeply connected. And so there's a lot of, as you said, Meriem, there's a lot of flow of information, technology, and ideas across countries. And so we need to have international cooperation to ensure that those technologies are, developed and shared in a way that's really responsible, and also that they're meeting international standards, as Francesca has pointed out. And so one of the new organizations that has been created to support deeper collaboration and cooperation internationally on responsible AI is the Global Partnership on AI. So this was really sort of announced by Canada and France in 2018 as a open to every interested party initiative. And in the summer of this year, it was launched as an official program with 15 member organizations coming in. And the mission of the Global Partnership on AI is really, as they state it, to guide the development of responsible AI in a way that promotes human rights, diversity, inclusion, but also fosters innovation and economic growth. So it's really, the first international organization of its kind that brings member organizations, interested parties together to collaborate and cooperate. And so they've got 4 working groups and also now a special interest committee working on the opportunities for AI to support our recovery from COVID, both the health side of things, but also the economic side of things. And the 4 working groups came together this summer. They have multilateral stakeholders, they have international members and experts from all around the world leading these working groups. And one of the ones that I want to point out, because I think it's relevant to this panel, is the Responsible AI Working Group, which is co-chaired by Yoshua Bengio from Canada and Raja Shatila from the Sudan, and a leader on the IAAA standards work. And so that working group has already identified their first project. They are taking an inventory of the many AI for good principles, tools, audits, assessments, recommendations, certifications all around the world, and really bringing them together. As Francesca said, there's more than 80 of these, but bringing them together to identify where there are synergies and opportunities for integration and coordination amongst the existing frameworks, but also where are the gaps? What other work do we need to do as a global community in order to implement AI in a responsible and coordinated way? And also, what are the opportunities for scaling some of the initiatives that already exist, some of the best practices out there in the world that maybe other countries, other sectors might not be aware of. And so that work has already begun. And the first plenary meeting of the working groups is being hosted by Canada in December of this year. So we're really looking forward to seeing the outcomes of that work and seeing where the GPI will take us as an international community of like-minded countries cooperating on responsible AI.
We'll definitely keep a close eye out for that one. Daniel, I would like to go back to you and just, if we can just journey back to the idea of designing regulation itself, even though it's questionable whether it should be designed in the first place. There are many governments around the world that might be tempted to perhaps overreact and design sort of knee-jerk policies, which can obviously negatively impact companies and stifle innovation. If a government wishes to design regulation, how can they strike a balance between being perhaps overreactive and underreactive when it comes to the design?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And of course, that's an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially with the long time spans for promoting and then getting new laws and regulations into place and so on. But as a practitioner, or at least a former practitioner in building concrete AI systems, basically, I would urge for a relatively conservative approach, but rather look at legislation as something useful to create innovation with the within the AI space, because that's definitely doable. And if we listen to the former presentation on basically designing in responsible AI practices, I think this is quite doable in many situations, that we actually, if we continuously ask ourselves, especially when we build larger scale AI systems, what could go wrong, how do we mitigate it, do we have the right data, and so on, make sure that we document this process, that we've at least asked ourselves these questions. Often the systems that come out are, I wouldn't say guaranteed safe, but at least relatively reliable. So if we push for regulation that makes that not, if not mandatory, at least something that people look at and get something out of, some kind of, not guarantee that everything's going to be all right legally and so on, but at least a base to stand on. We have done our homework. We're not going to be in trouble immediately. So that is something that legislation can actually be used for, and that would really push innovation in this space. We can also use legislation from the government side to promote a few uses of AI. We can, for example, demand certain types under secure conditions of data sharing. We can actually demand data standards, model standards, and so on. That will really enhance adoption of AI at scale. And I really do think it's time to think in these kinds of terms now, because what companies and also public sector, at least here where we work, really need right now is a clear playing field. And not only just clear legal requirements and regulations, but also best practices, standards, and examples of how to use these so that they can feel secure in what they're building. I don't think that most organizations and government agencies and so on have a mission to be evil. I really hope not, and I think that if we just give them the tools to act on this responsibly, they will use them.
Well, let's hope so.
Yes.
So, Francesca, if I could come back to you. In your previous answer, you mentioned the importance of operationalizing principles, and that's really where the effort should go into, following the design of principles, standards, guidelines. So I wanted to really ask you a follow-up to that. What are some of the ways that organizations and institutions are incorporating responsible AI practices into the development and implementation of machine learning-based applications?
Yeah, that's again, as I said, is a very important process that is, it's time to do, and and of course we understand that it's a process that is will go on for a long time, and will improve. But it's really very important to devote resources and time and efforts within a company that produces AI on that process. And that process has a lot of dimensions. It starts with educating the developers' communities, making them aware of the possible, for example, unconscious bias that they can inject into these AI systems if they're not careful enough, also. And as Daniel said, that this is something that is going to be a process revision that needs to be integrated since the very first day of the starting of the design of a new product. So really, education activities are really very important for developers. But another thing is also, yes, once you educate, you say, okay, be careful about the bias. You say, okay, I understand, but how do I do that? How do I revise my process? So you need to give them toolkits that are easy to use for them and that are contextual to the process that they already have in place. They cannot be just generic toolkits off the shelf and then you say, oh, use this toolkit. You have to understand what is the current process and how these toolkits can be injected and can be used and easily integrated in that process. Because if it's not easily integrated, then it's not sustainable. You need to make it easy for them to integrate these additional checks or these additional phases of the pipeline. And then, of course, another thing is that you need to be put in place also a bi-directional discussion between whatever committee is going to define this new methodology and the developers community, which is very, very large, like in a company like IBM. So you need to listen to them, to welcome their challenges in integrating these new things into the pipeline and possibly modify the methodology that you are putting in place. So really a lot of discussion at these two levels. To listen to the community, to make sure again that the methodology that one is proposing from the top is actually well accepted. Well, I don't want to say top and bottom, but I mean from one side or the other one. And then, of course, you need to put in place also the governance to enforce and check what what is being done and how it is being done. And this is also something that needs to be done with a lot of discussion, community and sharing and design thinking processes and so on. And to the point that, these new processes around AI ethics have to be just not an add-on to the current pipeline, but an integral part. And one way to do that is also to learn from the past, from other kinds of issues that were at the beginning an add-on, and now they are completely integrated. So, for example, security. Security at the beginning was like an add-on, an additional thing to check besides what you were producing. Now, of course, it's an integral part of the pipeline for developing an AI system or any IT system. So, of course, security is not the same as AI ethics, but it's the process of making it an integral part of the pipeline. So overall, it really a lot of different stakeholders within the company itself that needs to communicate and coordinate and share ideas and challenges and suggestions and so on. And also, again, from the company point of view, I want to reiterate the importance of having this bidirectional learning process with the external world. And the GPAI that Elissa mentioned is also one example where I am a member of that responsible AI working group, and really I have a high expectation to understand in also a multicultural way, because of course there are 15 countries from all over the world, because things can be a little bit different in terms of the detail of implementing these solutions to AI ethics issues around the different regions of the world, but with some core, agreement of what are the principles and where we want to go. And what I like about the global partnership on AI is that it has a vision of the future. It doesn't work just incrementally, say, let's fix this problem, let's fix this other problem. It says, okay, what's our vision of the future? It is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is where we want to go. So whatever trajectory we are going to put in place for AI, it has to be a trajectory that goes more or less into that direction. So it's not just an incremental way of fixing, AI ethics issues.
Thank you. Thank you. Finally, Elissa, just kind of going more high level as a question, what are the potential downsides of AI that need to be prevented or minimized as a priority?
Yeah, I mean, there are many. They are widely discussed in the media and in different fora. And, I loved Francesca's point about looking to the past and learning from the past, right? So as she mentioned, we've had all kinds of technical innovations in our society over the last century or so that we have had to, come to terms with. How do we implement these in a way that's responsible and for the benefit of humanity? So one example I can think of is, international arms treaties, right? So there's a lot that we can learn from how we handled the development of those kinds of technologies 50, 60, 70 years ago, when we think about AI and arms control, right? And so that's one place where we really need to work together as a global community, learn from our history, learn from what has worked effectively, and also plan for the future. I think that's one really good example. The other one that I mentioned right at the beginning is privacy, right? So privacy is one of those things where, of course, we need to make sure that we're protecting the privacy and security of personal data, but we also need to make sure that data is available for research and innovation purposes. AI doesn't work if there's no data. We cannot develop and adopt AI without data. And so there's a really important balance that needs to be struck there. And I also think that there's an incredible amount of technical advances and innovation that needs to happen around privacy, around security, around building ethics by design, even into our development of AI systems. And so those are two areas I would say that we have to really work collaboratively and cooperatively as a global community. But they are urgent, and in one case, it will protect us, and in another case, it will enable the further development and adoption of AI.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I look forward to seeing those developments materialize around the world. Well, that's really all we have time for on today's panel. I'd like to thank the panelists very much for a great discussion. And thanks as well to the audience for tuning in. I believe questions will be answered